Actually, it's Cindy Renee. Yo soy de Bayard, 15 minutos atrás. I am from Bayard. Although I grew up there, I didn't learn about the history of segregation in Grant County until I was a junior in high school. And that is only because of my grandfather, David. He would ask his grandchildren, "What did you learn in school today?" And we would have a genuine conversation. So one fateful day, he asked me that question, and I was telling him that I was doing a research paper on South Africa and apartheid. And he stopped me and he said, "Well, did you know that Hurley was segregated between the Mexicanos and the Gringos?" And of course, I had not learned that history in school, so that was a shocker to me. And that conversation truly sparked an undying interest in the topic. So, my senior year, I did a research paper on segregation in Hurley, and I interviewed my grandparents for the majority of the information in the paper. And my grandpa spent part of his childhood in Hurley, North Hurley, and my grandma grew up in Bayard. And from my grandma's perspective, there was no segregation or discrimination in Bayard like there was in Hurley. But fast forward 10 years later, when I'm doing my thesis, an oral history project on the topic, two of the participants, Maria and Elena, went to Bayard Elementary and spent part of their childhood in Bayard. And their experiences were very different from my grandmother's. Elena was actually my grandmother's age, the same grade. And Maria was a later generation. She was going to school at Bayard Elementary in 1964 is when she started first grade. And she started first grade not knowing any English. And her first grade teacher would punish the students who spoke Spanish that day by lining them up at the back of the room, getting a blue bar of soap from her closet, and with a paring knife, shaving off a piece, and with her body language, asking them to stick out their tongue to receive the soap. And so the children were given the soap to eat as punishment for speaking Spanish for the day, during the day. And so Maria learned English under these circumstances in the first grade with this type of punishment for speaking Spanish. Elena also experienced emotional and physical abuse for speaking Spanish in school, as did one of the other participants, Gilbert, who went to the silver schools. But what is interesting about Elena's story is a story involving her little brother. Elena and her little brother were in the same class one year because Elena got held back. And her little brother was actually the teacher's pet. He was very favored by her, and he could speak all the Spanish he wanted. He could help the other students with their work, no punishment. And I asked Elena, "Was your little brother light complected?" And she said, "Oh yes, he was very fair." And you know, it dawned on me that that is why my grandmother's perspective was so different. Very light complected, as a number of people in my family. And so I realized that colorism happens in Grant County. And if, for those of you who don't know what that phenomenon is, it's when a non-white person with light skin experiences privilege and doesn't experience the full extent of racism, if at all. And so light skin privilege is like white privilege or male privilege. It's something you're born with. It's not something you earn. It's not something you should be ashamed of, but it's something that you should recognize because it's going to affect your perspective on the world and affect your life experiences. And so I had to reckon with that when I was doing this project. Something else I had to reckon with while doing this project was the way that I racially identify myself. It's all very confusing for the Hispanic community here, and Gilbert says best because he says, you know, we really don't know what to call ourselves because from person to person in our community, you know, it could be Chicano, Hispanic, Latino, Mexican American, Mexicano. It just depends on the person and their reasons for identifying that in that way. And for me, I have always identified as Hispanic because that's kind of the way I grew up filling out the forms, like, you know, whenever you're asked to identify your race. But even that was super confusing for me because according to these forms, I have an ethnicity but not a race, so I knew I needed to check Hispanic, but then when it asked for you to identify your race, you know, I don't fit into any of these boxes. But then because of this project, I had to dive into the history of our people, and so I learned, you know, going back all the way to Spanish colonization, to the Treaty of Guadalupe, to the present, that, you know, our people are basically mixed race, and we're gonna have a combination of white, Spaniard, Native American, African American, because the Spaniards bought African slaves. So we are a mixed race people. So I started checking white, Native American, and African American on these forms just to be corrected according to history. Because I found out that if you don't check anything, you're counted as white. And I also learned from some of my family that they didn't know what to check, so they check white even though they wouldn't identify that way in a social situation. And so it's a good way to erase a lot of people, those forms. And so that's the way I resist being erased, checking all those boxes that apply. And when you look at just my family and the way that we identify, how it's changed from generation to generation, my great-grandma Jesusita, she identified as puro Mexicana, even though she didn't immigrate nor did her parents from Mexico. And I grew up my whole life until recently thinking that she didn't know any English. And my grandmother corrected this notion, and I asked her, I was like, well, why was she always speaking to us in Spanish? That's why I thought she didn't know any English. And she told me, well, she hated that you didn't know Spanish and wanted to teach you. And so that's why she was always speaking to you in Spanish, to help you learn. And, you know, I realized how resilient my great-grandmother was in resisting the pressure to assimilate. And because so many of us have lost the language because we weren't taught it to protect us from those experiences in school. And in honor of my great-grandmother, I have decided to also identify as puro Mexicana.